Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review the movie Saw, the original Saw film. Really, when going into here, I'm kind of surprised that I haven't headed into this franchise a lot earlier. I think it honestly took me realizing that Spiral, the other addition to a Saw film, Spiral, is being released within days for me to just go like, you know what, I should probably actually sit down and actually watch a Saw film. Uh, Not because thinking that that could like Saw movies will probably be a trending thing because of Spiral. Like I'm just going like, well, hey, like why haven't I finally like sat down and watched one of these films and reviewed it? Like it just kind of like baffled me why I didn't get to that point yet. Really, when starting and watching this film and reminding myself that a lot of people would probably say that the original Saw film is fairly slow, and a lot of people will probably say that there isn't enough going on within this film. That really it's an escape room film, that really it's just like you're waiting 90 minutes for someone to eventually cut off their leg or foot or whatever. And really, I have to say that I think this very first Saw film, honestly, the way I pitch it as this is a movie that I think they wanted to kind of not put enough effort or not put enough stuff into this very first film because they realized that this was going to be eventually a franchise. Like, I think they knew they had something here, and I think they knew that this movie was going to be successful. And I think they wanted to kind of slow this very first movie down because they realized that eventually they were going to have to do more puzzles, they were going to have to do more tricks, they were going to have to do a lot more things down the line. To where eventually we get a massive cluster of different kind of actors that have been tied to these films and have really given us a full length story about different ways of which that this story has come into fray, where it's been a bulk of the time a character who is called Jigsaw, who we at some point were led to believe that this character was going to die at some point, or maybe he didn't die, or maybe they had a sequel Saw movie where actually he wasn't dead, or maybe somebody was actually Saw the entire time, or Jigsaw the entire time, and we were unaware of it, or whichever, and then it just kept getting handed down to whoever would be the next Jigsaw, and so on and so forth uh, within this movie franchise. Going into this film, I would say that I don't mind the fact that this movie is fairly slow because this is basically the introduction of this franchise. And so eventually, once we get to the other films, uh, that eventually you can enjoy more because of how complex and complicated that they are. And eventually, uh, here is the thing. Eventually, once you even get into this movie and others, you're eventually going to bizarrely root for people that you wouldn't think that you would probably root for just because they are in this jigsaw like puzzle. And like it's kind of interesting how like in the very beginning of this Saw movie, how there actually was a lot of rough draft like things that I'm sure that they had to try to iron out to figure out how exactly to go about this movie. To where eventually, with sequels of this film, they kind of perfected and they kind of made a lot better. Really, we have it to where I think in this very first film, we kind of have to heavily rely on like tape recorders and those things. Like very rarely did we have a Jigsaw coming on as the puppet character through a TV to give you some kind of heads up of what's going on. I think within the sequels, I think they do kind of still kind of do a give and take with that, but I think we have a lot more of the puppet Jigsaw. I think a lot more in the sequels compared to the original, where it kind of relies on the whole taping like thing, because uh, there are very few times where and very few clues within this film compared to all the other ones where there's just like a maze of clues that these people have to run through, and it makes for a much more like I think it makes more of a visually interesting impact when we actually have Jigsaw who's on these TVs who is talking to these people rather than it just being a tape recording at some point in juncture. Uh, going into this, really a lot of people could have mixed feelings about the Saw franchise in general. Some people might actually hate all of the Saw movies. Some people might just hate certain Saw films. Some people might be much more excited for eventually a Saw sequel for me to talk about rather than the original film, and so on and so forth. Uh, Really, the one thing that I remember about one of these Saw films is we actually had a singer that I actually did really enjoy within one of these movies was actually Chester Bennington, which a lot of people know him from Linkin Park. Like I was just like, oh my god, like I was so amazed when he was actually in one of these Saw movies. Um, and then uh and so like no matter what happened after that, like that was the one connecting thing where it was like, dude, I don't care how bad these Saw movies are anymore, like I just want to watch like this one Saw movie. But I did realize that I had to like get all the other Saw films to get to this one, because that's what I always would try to watch them all in order. Hence why I'm not skipping to the very last Saw film and reviewing that, so that way I can just get to Spiral. No, I'm going all the way to the beginning and working my way up. So, with that said, I honestly like that we end up having a much more kind of detective like way about going about this movie, uh, where we end up having them trying to figure out who this Jigsaw like character is. We end up having us kind of questioning who the Jigsaw character could be, whether it could be Dr. Lawrence Gordon or it could be any number of people. And it seems that also it's kind of interesting in the very early on of this franchise where we end up having cases where rarely anyone actually did succeed uh, through these puzzles, through these mazes, through these whatever, to where eventually I think once we get to sequels, there seems to be quite possibly more survivors that are to survive within this, which I think is really interesting. But that doesn't happen all the time, sadly enough. And plus, there are very horrific ways of which that it seems like, dude, like this is so gross. Some of the puzzles and some of the things are just so nasty, and I'm like, oh my god, this is horrifying to watch. To where like looking at just this first Saw film, it's just kind of like, oh, okay, well, like okay, this is kind of like the easy way into this franchise until we get to like the points where like people are diving into a hole of needles and all kinds of things, and eventually we'll get there. And I'm like, oh my god, like this is just, but eventually we'll get to those points. So with that said, I actually like this franchise as a whole. It gets more interesting, it gets more fascinating, and it gets to a point of us realizing that uh, like you just can't wait for another one of these movies to come out just to kind of see like where they're going to take you down a rabbit hole of sorts and fascinate us this time around to see who is the jigsaw at the end of this or who is going to be a part of this next maze. Who are we going to have to forcibly root for who we weren't expecting to? So, with that said, let's get into that spoiler time. Because reasonably, I didn't have much to really actually say about this movie. I think I said more about the franchise, about the film overall, than anything else. Because it's a really simple film. I really like the fact that we end up having one moment that I actually kind of laughed. I always kind of laugh at these kind of points in this movie, and we end up having Dr. Lawrence Gordon, who ends up going onto the phone to his wife or his daughter, and he ends up saying, "Hallie," or he ends up like saying the names of his family, and I can't help but laugh every time because it just sounds weird. Like his delivery just sounds like goofy to me. When we end up having like him like shouting at the phone, and then we end up having his wife get on the phone, and then he's like, "Holly," I'm like, oh my god. I'm like, wow, this is like such a goofy transitional like scene here, and I think that that was just fairly odd. Every time I hear it, I just laugh bizarrely because like I'm gonna get you, you murderer, and then like his wife gets on the phone, he's like, "Allie," like it's hilarious. So with that said, let's bust out the double five if I haven't already, because it's spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So really, I'm just kind of having like I'm just trying to figure out how to exactly start this film because I don't even realize how exactly it like starts to go. So I guess I'll have to try to like figure out how the best way is to like start this film and hope it starts a similar way because I'm just gonna try to uh, do this and that. So we end up having uh, we end up having a guy named Adam who is to wake up in a tub filled I guess filled with water. So we end up having Adam who is simply trying to get out of this tub. We end up having him accidentally hitting something into the drain of this tub on his way out of it, and so we end up having Adam who ends up uh, making his way out of this tub to try to figure out where like his grounds are, to where he's trying to like touch around and figure out where exactly he is. And here's the good thing about this movie. We can actually, yeah, there's a dark moment within this room, but we can actually see what's actually going on. Thank goodness for that. Like so like even in these dark moments, we can actually see what's going on. Where bravo to whoever thought about this to where it makes the room just dark enough to where you can still see what's going on. And bravo to whoever came up with that lighting scheme because I was assessing or assuming that people weren't going to be able to see this movie whatsoever in the very beginning of this. So we end up having Adam who is kind of scrounging around to be able to find some light source somewhere in a room that he's not familiar with. And so we end up having Dr. Lawrence Gordon eventually also like trying to talk to Adam because Adam is shouting about, and we end up having Gordon who is to like say like, "Hey man, I've tried that." Like, "Hey man, like I'm in the dark just like you." Like we end up having Adam shouting to Gordon to like turn on the light, and like Gordon's like, "Wouldn't you have thought that I would have thought of that?" like come on, like I'm trying to get out of here as much as you. Like I just appeared here as just as you did. And so we eventually have Gordon turning on this light, and we end up having, of course, both Gordon and Adam realizing that they are chained to some pipe somewhere. We end up having Adam, who is of course, consistently trying to pull at his chains, trying to see if he could, like, pull his leg uh, from his chain, which I thought was like the bizarre thing to do. I'm like, dude, you would need to like you need to break your leg to have that thing slip off. It's not just like I know a lot of people who probably uh normally would get like handcuffed or whatever and would try to like see if they could like shimmy the handcuffs off, but it always comes down to you having to like break off your hand or your leg to slip out of this kind of thing. And even with that, like, breaking your leg would not get this chain off, and really it would just leave you in a lot of pain and would be pointless, because I've just seen it in other movies. So we end up having both Adam and Gordon realizing that there is seemingly some dead man in the middle uh, of this bizarre looking bathroom, and we end up seeing that this man has a bullet hole in his head. He ends up having a gun in one hand, and he ends up having a recording device in another. And so we seemingly end up having both of these people eventually realizing that uh, they have uh, found that they have some uh, like tape in their pockets, and so we end up having Adam uh, trying to get the recording device, and he ends up like taking his shirt and taking also some other kind of other piece to try to fling to get to the recording, and he ends up retrieving it. And so, like, man, like, what if any number of these people could not have figured out any number of this stuff to try to get like shirts and all kinds of things to try to get at these recordings? Or what if they luckily did not have these shirts or did not have these whatever to get to these pieces? Wouldn't have that have sucked? So because really, like, this gun and this recording thing are kind of like in the middle of the room to where it's not easy to get to. So we end up having it to where eventually Adam is to get the recording device and he is to play his tape, where it's to basically cryptically spell out that this guy is not who he seems he is. And we end up having it to where it doesn't really say that this guy uh, is a photographer, and it doesn't exactly say what exactly that Adam has done, but we are to assess or to assume that Adam has done some shady like things. And so we end up having Gordon, who is like, well, hey, like, throw the tape recorder to me, like, so I can play my tape. And we end up having Adam who's like, no, like, I'm not going to break this recording thing. Like, just throw your tape over to me and I will play it. So Gordon tosses it over, and so we end up having Adam who ends up playing the tape. And so we end up having also Gordon's tape kind of cryptically, like, not exactly saying what Gordon is really accused of here. And we end up having it to where after the tape is all said and done, we end up having it to where Gordon wants to hear the tape yet again, and kind of like rewind it and try to like hear some things in the background, or otherwise to try to hear this guy. And so we end up having Gordon wanting Adam to throw him the recorder, and he does, and he ends up catching it, and he ends up just trying to play it back to just kind of hear like little things in the background, or just kind of a little tone of something, so he can kind of make some things out. So I'm gonna pause here for a second. Okay, so we end up having Gordon realize that he is to assume that this must be him ending up in this jigsaw puzzle, because Gordon had almost been accused of being Jigsaw at one point in time, and so now we have to go through that rabbit hole of the flashback of him being accused of that. And so, because we end up having Adam, who is like, well, like, what are you talking about? Like, what do you mean? And we end up having Gordon, who had mentioned that, yeah, like, he had almost been accused of Jigsaw, and just because he didn't actually have a reasonably good alibi for him to have been not at the hospital and not at home during certain times. So we end up having it uh, to where Gordon is to give us a flashback leading us up to the point of which that he had gotten caught. So we end up having seemingly both Detective Danny Tapp and seemingly another detective. Uh, what is the other? Detective Stephen Singh going to uh, going to Gordon and eventually coming them with like, well, hey, like, it seems like you're the only doctor that seems to not have an alibi for these dates, and because you weren't actually working on these days, it's like, well, hey, like, we're gonna bring you into the police station to till eventually you give us an alibi for these dates. And we end up having Gordon, who is like, well, like, I was seeing a patient those nights, or I was seeing an acquaintance that night. And we end up having both the detectives that are like, well, yeah, no, we don't believe you. You need to tell us the real true story. And so we end up having eventually Gordon going to his lawyer, and his lawyer basically telling him, it's like, well, hey, man, like, bite the bullet and tell them the truth. Like, whatever happens uh, to your relationship with your wife, it's like, hey, man, just bite the bullet. So we end up having Gordon, who gives the alibi to the detectives, saying that he was having an affair with the woman and it never actually went into anything. And so we have it to where the detective Stephen Singh had checked out that alibi, and really it was the alibi did fit. We end up finding out that Gordon seems to have a number of certain doctors, and we end up finding out that it seems that eventually we end up having Gordon, who seems to have uh, a janitor-esh like guy that is by the name of Zep. It seems that Gordon is to do his rounds with a bunch of doctors talking about a number of his patients, and we end up having Zep correcting Gordon on the name of one of Gordon's patients, because Gordon doesn't even bother to know any of the names of any of his patients. Also, it seems that Gordon, I guess, would have probably falsely diagnosed one of his patients as well, and it seems that that false diagnosis is going to come back to haunt him at some point. So we end up having it to where uh, Gordon is to eventually have an alibi, and so we end up bizarrely having it to where it seems that right next door we end up having a woman named Amanda, who is giving her statement about all the things that happened when she was involved in her uh, Saw-like puzzle event thing. And so we end up having Amanda sitting in with seemingly Detective David Tapp, and she's going over what had happened to her. So it seems that she had been put into some jaw of life like device of sorts, where it seems that, of course, if you've seen the visuals, like it's basically one of those trap like things that end up kind of completely opening up somebody's mouth to the point of it basically like destroying the skull and so on and so forth. We end up having this girl who was ending up sitting in this seat, uh, waking up to eventually uh, get a video telling her uh, that how this trap exactly works, and that she needs to hurry or this trap will eventually go and kill her. And so she needs to go uh, and get to the man of which that is over by her, who is supposedly dead, that she needs to go and find the key within this person's body to go and unlock her device so she can take it off before it goes off. So we end up having Amanda, who is desperately trying to figure out how she can just kind of take this device off without having to get to the key. But we end up having Amanda sitting up to where we end up having this triggering some string of sorts coming off of this device to where a timer has started without her realizing it. And she has 60 seconds before this thing ends up going off. So we end up having Amanda who's scrambling over to this dead body to realize that she needs to go and stab within it. And she is just very hesitant about it. And eventually we also have the dead body, who we are to have her assume is a dead body, is actually not actually a dead body. This guy is just filled with drugs, and that it seems like he is slowly but surely awaking while Amanda is hovering over this body. And so we end up having Amanda, who is now stabbing into this body, which obviously she can see that it's alive. She opens it up, tries to desperately dive into this body, and she ends up grabbing the key, taking the key off, and taking her device off right before it ends up going off. And so we end up having the Jigsaw puppet on the bike strolling in to let her know that she has won. She has been victorious. It seems that Amanda was a druggie of sorts, and so uh, this moment there was to give her a second chance so that way she would correct her life. We end up having Amanda finding out after this whole ordeal was over that Amanda thought that what Jigsaw did was a way of her actually getting herself out of this horrible situation that she was in, and try to think about resetting her and bringing her life back together, and putting her best foot forward instead of just completely giving up. So we end up having uh, Gordon tell us that, or we end up having people tell us about Jigsaw, how really we end up having Jigsaw is a person that doesn't kill his people that he sends through these puzzles. He lets the people decide to whether or not to kill themselves, or take off their own arm or leg or whatever to survive, and so that they can realize that their life before this was all a mistake, and now like getting them to survive is to realize that uh, like their life is worth living and that they should put their best foot or leg or whatever forward after this moment is all done. Um, so we end up having now I kind of want to go into the whole like detective chase of all of this. So we end up having both detective David and detective Stephen going through some of Jigsaw's other cases, which they end up arriving to the very end of all of these cases. We end up having at some point a guy who is gone by the name Paul, where we end up having this character who seems to be a person, I believe, who is to, I guess, cut himself. And so we end up having it to where Paul has to make this decision to go through this maze of this barbed wire to be able to get out of this maze by 3 o'clock. And it seems like this guy ends up slowly trying to eventually get through this maze, but it ends up just leaving him in a very bloody, battered like mess. And so we end up having eventually Paul not being able to succeed in what he has done. And so we end up having eventually the detectives coming in and finding this guy dead. We end up having another case of a guy named Mark who is to be seemingly slathered in some kind of uh, flammable liquid, like some kind of wax or some kind of something of sorts. And so we end up having Mark who has to figure out the combination of his escape. He ends up having to figure out some combination of some door for him to be able to get out of. And he needs to be able to do that before his candle ends up completely lighting out, to where he can no longer find the combination of the thing that is going to set him free. So we end up having Mark, who ends up trying to figure out the combination that is seemingly all over the walls, and we end up eventually having it to where Mark ends up uh, eventually whittling down his candle to nothing, to where eventually the candle ends up lighting Mark on fire, to where he ends up just burning alive. And eventually we also end up having the detectives finding Mark as well, and finding out that it seems that Jigsaw likes to go and watch his victims try to make it through these puzzles, and so on and so forth. I think when we have both Gordon and Adam's situation, we end up seeing that I think there is something with the mirror that is actually in uh, this saw room, where I think behind that mirror is probably a camera of a feed of sorts for someone to be able to see. Hence why I think at some point they end up breaking the mirror to have a little piece fall off of it. And I guess we were to assume that behind that mirror is probably a camera of sorts that is uh, in front of it, like bulletproof glass or whatever, so they wouldn't break through that. So going on here, going back to Gordon and Adam, because I think we kind of covered everything. Uh, we end up having also David Tapp, who is Danny Glover's character, who is kind of still suspicious of Gordon, and he could quite possibly still think that Gordon has some kind of tie with Jigsaw. And so we eventually have it to where it seems that we eventually do find that both Detective David Tapp and Detective Steven Sting eventually do get to find uh, Jigsaw's lair, as well as it seems that they also get to find Jigsaw in the middle of some uh, new puzzle that he is doing with some guy who is strapped within this chair to eventually, from both sides of him, get a drill that is coming into his neck. And so we end up having it to where both of these detectives show up at this lair to eventually have to uh, wait for Jigsaw to appear so that way they can finally see what he looks like, and so that way they could also bust him. And so while we have both Detective Tapp and Detective Steven here, we end up having to realize that this home is littered with traps. We end up finding out through a lot of this other franchise that consistently there is always some kind of trap within this home, to where eventually we end up finding out that somebody ends up breaking a leg or something else because there is some kind of goofy trap where we are not to realize it until we're realizing it with the a person that ends up falling through it. So we end up having eventually the two detectives finding Jigsaw, and well, I guess I'm going to have to pause here for a second. So we end up having both detectives end up stumbling upon Jigsaw, and then we end up having Jigsaw who ends up turning on one of his traps, to where all of a sudden these two drills are now almost going into this guy's neck, slowly but surely. And so we end up having Detective Steven Singh, who is jumping to go and grab the keys to try to figure out what is the right key to be able to seemingly try and unlock this trap. And so we end up having it to where Detective Steven and Detective Tapp are yelling to Jigsaw to tell him what exactly is the right key to unlock this man, and Jigsaw will not give that information up. To where eventually Detective Steven ends up to just decide to shoot the drills so that way they just stop working, to where it stops this trap. And so we end up eventually having Jigsaw going uh, and talking about his his reasoning for doing this, and how much he just kind of hates people and so on and so forth, and to where we end up eventually having Jigsaw popping out a knife that he ends up slicing the neck of David Todd, and we end up having Jigsaw running off to where Detective Steven ends up running after him, to realize that he is running into a trap. That when Steven ends up running to get to Jigsaw, he ends up running into a trap where it's lined to where there is going to be shotguns that end up going off from the roof above, to where this guy ends up getting shot in the head and killed. To where eventually we end up having Detective David, who ends up trying to chase after Steven to catch that he is dead. And so we end up eventually having it to where David makes that out of this alive because this is a flashback, and we end up having David now with a noticeable scar over his neck. And so we eventually have it to where when someone is to ask at some point, what does what does David look like? The answer is that he has a scar over his neck, because we end up finding out that the guy who ended up paying Adam was actually the detective David the entire time. So we end up having us back with Gordon and Adam. And so we end up having us eventually get to the point of eventually them trying to scavenge and to try to find where anything is within this environment. And eventually we end up having Adam, who ends up having this baggie of stuff that he ends up tearing open, to where he ends up finding two saws, of course. He ends up going and trying to see if he can go and saw off his chains, which of course he can't. And so we end up having Adam trying to saw any number of things, and eventually the saw breaks, and so Adam flings it across the room because it doesn't work. So we end up having Gordon come to the consensus of like, well, he doesn't want us to cut through our chains, he wants us to cut through our feet. Hence why we have the chain, or hence why we have the saw. So we end up having Adam also noticing that there is a photo of Gordon's family being held hostage, and then in the back of the photo that there's a clue there that says that they need to shut off the lights for a clue to be seen, kind of thing. And so we eventually end up having Adam tossing this photo off to the side to where Gordon does not see it, because he doesn't want him to see any number of things that also is also within this little bag, because we also have it to where there are other photos within that bag that Adam doesn't want Gordon to see. So we end up having Adam trying to pull at Gordon, just like, well, hey man, like, were you really going and seeing a patient, or what were you really doing? Like, what really got you here? Because we eventually have it to where we have to show Adam and like how he got here. Because we end up having it to where Adam mentions that he had gone home to his hole, and he ended up all of a sudden awakening in here, which was an actual literal hole. And so we end up showing that Adam is a photographer, and that he had been developing photos, and it seems that his home had gone black. So we end up having Adam, who ends up walking into his home, flashing his camera with his flash, so that way he can see. We end up having Adam, who is kind of asking around his home, like, okay, who's in here? Like, who's here? And so Adam eventually opens up, I think, a closet or another door of his, to eventually have this pig-headed, like, jigsaw-ish like person grabbing Adam, chloroforming him, and then having him wake up here. So we are to eventually have it to where Gordon's goal is to eventually kill Adam. Because if Gordon is to shoot Adam, Gordon is to be set free. And so we end up having it to where we have it to where eventually Adam tells Gordon to shut off the light, and we have Gordon who ends up doing so, and he ends up revealing that there is an X that had been lit up in this room, because I guess the light needed to showcase this part of this wall. So we have Gordon, who ends up trying to break through this wall and does, and finds a number of things there. He ends up finding a cell phone, which can't make calls, it can only receive them, and a cigarette. And we end up having Jigsaw leaving the doctor a note that says, "Shush, doctor. Uh, if anything, like, if you kind of put blood onto these cigarettes, you can kill Adam just as good as a bullet." So we eventually have it to where Adam is wanting the actual cigarette. And Gordon is like, "Dude, you're going to stick something in your mouth that you found within this room?" And Adam's like, "Well, why not? Like, at least I'll get like one last cigarette and whatever." So we eventually have it to where Gordon is to try and make a plan with Adam that he is going to pretend that the cigarette that he's giving Adam is laced with poison, but it's not. They end up turning out the light and try to talk to one another to try and see if they can be able to get out of here via doing that. And so we end up having Gordon tossing Adam the cigarette, and Adam ends up lighting up, and then he ends up faking that he's having some uh, illness or some problem. And so obviously this guy like is not looking like he's dying really all that well. So we eventually have it to where Adam ends up keeling over supposedly to get actually electrocuted via his chains, to where Adam says, "Oh my god, like did you feel that? Like, what the heck? Like, why did they do that to me?" And we end up having Gordon who's like, "Oh my god, like, why did you wake up? Like, why? Like, you should have pretended that you're dead." And we had it to where Adam's like, "Dude, I just got electroshocked by my chain and I got electrocuted. Like, I'm not gonna like fake that I'm dead while I'm getting electrocuted." Because we really have it to where there's an inside man in this whole thing, and we gotta figure out who that exactly is. So we end up having it to where eventually Gordon is to eventually get calls because we end up having Zepp, who is getting antsy, and he is going to uh, like we. Let's back up a little bit. We end up having also Gordon reflecting on the last thing that he had ever told his daughter. And so we end up having at some point that it seems that Gordon's daughter uh, is seemingly a character that Diana. Yeah, there we go. We end up having Diana, who seems to be fairly afraid of somebody being in her room. And so we end up having at some point Gordon trying to comfort her at some point by going into her room to investigate. But it seems that Diana consistently keeps seeing someone in her room. So we eventually at some point have Gordon, who is to eventually go and need to leave to go on to another one of his affairs. And we end up having Diana, who ends up asking uh, her father if she is ever going, or if he is ever going to leave both his mother, or her mother, and her. And Gordon says, like, "No, I'm never going to leave. Like, I'm always going to be here." And so we end up having it to where Gordon is to supposedly leave because he had gotten a page for yet another thing that he has to emergencyly leave. We end up having Gordon getting another page, And we have his daughter who's like, dude, I hate that thing. And he's like, well, like, Gordon's like, well, hey, but you know how, like, important my job is, right? Like, I'm saving lives. And Diana's like, well, yeah, sure, whatever. So we end up having Gordon leave to do yet another affair, and so we end up having Gordon going off to go on to do this affair, and he ends up realizing that maybe this is not a thing that he should be doing anymore. Maybe he should stop. And so we end up having Gordon almost going through this affair, but then he realizes that it's a wrong thing to do. And so we end up having it to where eventually Gordon is to get a call within this hotel, and Gordon asks the woman that he's with, like, well, like, you weren't expecting anybody to call here, were you? And she's like, no. Well, the phone call uh, is actually for Gordon, and so he ends up answering it, and we end up having this phone call actually being, I believe it's Zep, or I believe it's like somebody from uh, this whole Saw thing. So he ends up getting a phone call. It's not important, but we end up having eventually Gordon who needs to actually leave. So we end up having seemingly Gordon who is getting photographed. And right after Gordon is to eventually try and leave this affair, he ends up getting collected by this pig person. And of course, that's when eventually we have him to be sent to the Saw puzzle. So we are to eventually uh, get uh, get Gordon to eventually get a call. And immediately we have it to where Gordon naturally assumes that it's probably Jigsaw. And so we end up having Gordon answering this phone in anger to eventually realize it's actually one of his family members telling him that Adam isn't what he seems. Because we end up having it to where Zep ends up being into Diana's closet, and eventually Zep ends up going into this home to try and uh, uh, tie up and kidnap both Diana and Allison. And once that ends up happening, we end up having Detective David Tapp, who ends up thinking that Zep could quite possibly be a piece of the puzzle of Jigsaw. And so eventually we end up having Detective David ending up trying to follow and chase after Zep because he thinks that he is somehow tied to this whole Jigsaw-ish like thing. But that happens a little bit later. So we end up having Allison tell Gordon via this phone call that Adam isn't what he seems. And so Gordon needs to figure out why Allison is telling him that. And so we end up having Gordon who is asking Adam, like, what really had him get to this point? What really made him get here? And then we eventually have Adam eventually confess that it's because he had been uh, doing photos of Gordon. He had followed him and noticed that he was actually having an affair at a hotel, not actually going to some patient or some hospital somewhere. So we end up having Gordon realized that this guy had been after him, and we end up having Gordon ask who Adam was getting paid by, and the guy that was actually paying Adam was actually Detective Adam Tapp, or David Tapp. I mean, not Adam Tapp, David Tapp. And so because he ends up describing him, and Gordon is like, "Oh my God, that's the detective." So we end up having Gordon, who is to continue to get these calls, because eventually we end up having it to where it is getting later and later and later, and it is supposedly going to be that 6 o'clock uh, is when Gordon is supposed to kill Adam. And so we end up having it to where they end up noticing that there was a clock that was brand new, and this brand new clock is to tell him like, well, by 6 o'clock you need to kill Adam, or like you guys are gonna rot in here forever. So we end up having it to where it is past now 6 o'clock, and Adam realizes that, and so we end up having it to where Zepp is to call Gordon and to tell him it's like, well, hey, it's too late. Like you have failed, and so we end up having it to where now Zepp is going and trying to going to have to kill Allison and Diana, and we end up having the detective busting in and is now trying to wrestle with Zepp to uh, try and protect this family, but on top of that, to try and chase after Zepp to find out where Zepp is actually going. So we eventually head to Zepp eventually making his way back down to Gordon and Adam. And so we end up having Gordon, who's getting these phone calls of people being shot, people dying, and so we end up having Gordon, who is now frantically going like, "Oh, my family! Oh, like I failed them! Oh, horrible me!" And so we end up having it to where Gordon ends up deciding that he's like, well, like, I have to do something now. Like, my family needs me. My family needs me. And so we end up having Gordon, who ends up tying his leg, and he's going at his foot, he's going at his leg, he's just sawing it off. And we end up having Adam, who's like, oh my God. Oh my God, Gordon. Like, all this, like, horrific, and it's gross. It's nasty. And so we end up having Gordon just sawing off his foot. And like, I remember the movie Yes Man, where Jim Carrey is shouting at the TV. It's like, oh, come on, it took you 90 minutes to get to this point. Come on, just break the leg. Like, just do it. Like, we end up having it to where, like, Jim Carrey's watching this scene and just kind of like, and making fun of it, making a joke out of it. But so we end up having Gordon, who is to saw off his leg, and so now he is to basically try and crawl his way out of there. And so we end up having Zepp open up this door to go and try to check on both Adam and Gordon, and to basically tell them that they still have failed and now they're going to rot here forever, kind of thing. And so we end up having eventually that Adam ends up grabbing onto Zepp and ends up taking a part of this toilet, like the toilet like upper thing, lid thing, and he ends up just taking it, and he ends up smashing and caving in Zepp's head and killing him. To where eventually Gordon is to crawl to Adam and tell him, hey, stop, like he's dead, like you did it. So we end up having it to where Gordon is to tell Adam, like, hey, like, I'm gonna try and get out of here. Like, I will, like, I'll get help. Like, and we have to where Adam is like, hey, man, do you think that we're really gonna both get out of here? And Gordon is like, I'm not gonna promise you anything. Like, I'm not going to guarantee you anything. It's like, who knows? Because we end up having Zepp, who ended up going and shooting Detective David Tapp, and he is now dead within the end of this movie. And so we end up having Lawrence Gordon, who is to slowly but surely crawl out of there. And so we are to assess or to assume that probably he had died along the way of making it to the place where he needed to be, which we are to believe. Because unless you would see sequels, you never know. But anyways, we end up having Adam, who is still like not going to saw off his leg, and he is just like waiting for Gordon to come back to get him. And so after Gordon ends up slipping away, we end up having it to where Jigsaw ends up finally uh, moving and getting up from the middle of the room, and we end up having him pulling the back of the headpiece of which that he had and tossing it on the ground. And we end up having also that Gordon had also, before he had left, he had tried to shoot Adam, and Adam shot or Gordon had shot Adam in the chest, but that didn't do anything. That didn't actually seemingly kill Adam. And we had it to where Gordon is like, I did it, show them to me. But nobody was just like, okay, like Adam won. Let's give him his grand prize of his family. No, Gordon just slipped away. So Jigsaw ends up getting up and revealing to Adam that there actually was a key to the chains all along, and that actually it was in the tub of what of where Adam was. And we end up finding in the beginning of this movie that Adam accidentally knocked the key into the drain to where it is to have never been seen again. And so we end up having Adam who's like, oh, mother, like, dude, like, I killed the key. Like, the key is in the drain, and now I can't get to it, and now I'm never going to get out of here. And so we end up having eventually where Adam is to try and uh, pull the gun on Jigsaw, or he like Adam is trying to make a defense to try and kill Jigsaw so he can be able to just do something to get out of here. And Jigsaw seemingly has the button to press to electrify Adam to where we end up having Jigsaw, who is like, well, okay, well, like, you're gonna be left here to rot, like, game over. And so we end up having Jigsaw, who ends up completely closing Adam's puzzle on him, to where he's like, no. And so we end up locking Adam in here forever, or are we led to believe? Who knows? I'm assuming or assessing that at some point they had to have Adam get out of there. Like, I think they let this ending kind of open ended to have Adam eventually at some point come back to become a Jigsaw. Wouldn't that be a huge reveal? Because we had Gordon, who ended up having some part in some other Saw movie. It seems like whoever was tied to any parts of this Saw movie, at some point somebody ends up coming back. Wouldn't it be interesting to have actually Adam come back? Because I think they left it open ended enough to where Adam could have slipped out of there for one reason or another, and eventually could have been able to make it out of there. Because I don't know whether or not that they confirmed his death or not in the movies, but I could be wrong about this. But I guess recently, on top of that, I guess I would have to go and watch the sequel movies to see if they confirm his death or not. So with that said, yeah, that's all that I have to say about this movie. I spent an hour talking about it. I didn't realize I was going to spend that long. So with that said, I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.